Today we're going to do part 2 of Hodgepodge, so let's get going. As we mentioned before, in our seeded plants, which would be your gymnosperms and your angiosperms, the sporophytes are actually inside of the pollen grains. So microspores develop into pollen grains, which contain the male gametophyte. So the process of pollination is just when you take the pollen from one seed plant and you transfer it to another. Now, this could happen with the same plant, and this could be called self-pollination, in which the pollen from the same plant fertilizes the egg of that same seeded plant. Or pollination can occur when the pollen from one plant gets transferred to another plant. Now, this can happen through wind as well as insects. So you can have an insect like a bee land onto a flower, drink the nectar, and get food, of course, which causes the pollen to get stuck in their hairs. And as it then flies to another flower, it transfers some of that pollen from the first flower to the second flower. And so the whole big point of the pollen was that it eliminated the need for water to disperse the sperm. Now it can be dispersed great distances by the air or, as I said before, by animals. Okay, and so with fertilization, when the pollen grain actually germinates, it starts to grow. It gives rise to something called a pollen tube, and then within that pollen tube there will be 2 sperm that will actually go into the female gametophyte that's part of the ovule, which is inside of the flower. So this slide shows a whole bunch of different ways in which pollination can occur. So pollination can be done by the wind. Here you see your pollen cones, and this is kind of one of those big things we see every springtime, in which our cars and everything is coated by pollen, because the pollen is taken by the wind and distributed. Also, you can see with bees, so there's a lot of insects that can do it. So this shows us what a dandelion kind of looks like to you guys, or us, under normal light. This is what it looks like under ultraviolet light. So it kind of draws the bee to this inner part, which is where the pollen is. You could also have it by moths and butterflies. They're going to go also and land on different flowers and kind of maybe lay some offspring in there and various other parts. And then also birds like this this hummingbird can also help to transfer the pollen. So as we said before, having seeds is an evolutionary kind of component, and it became advantageous. So the seed actually develops from the whole ovule. So the ovule is inside of the flower, and then the seed develops from that. And so within that seed, you have your sporophyte embryo. So you have the embryo of that sporophyte, as well as a food supply, and then there's a coat that surrounds it. Now, the reason why seeds are evolutionary advantage is because of the fact that a seed can stay dormant for days to years. You can just have seeds just hanging out, and they are perfectly fine. There's enough food nutrients in there, as well as they're not really going through a lot of cell respiration. If you remember back to the cell respiration lab, we looked at germinated versus non-germinated peas. The non-germinated peas, of course, had a low cell respiration, which was very, very, very low, versus the germinated peas that were actively growing and going through cell respiration, of course, had that higher rate of cell respiration. And then they'll stay dormant until conditions are favorable. So now this favorable condition differs for each organism. Sometimes it's activated by heat, as we saw in our ecology unit, in which if there has been a fire, and that's going to kill a lot of the organisms in the area. That fire, that heat, stimulates these dormant seeds to grow, so that they can kind of try to get the advantage while the other plants are gone. Another type of condition that can be favorable for seeds to go through germination is water. And so if there is a large amount of water, sometimes that can cause the seed to swell, which would then, of course, get it to break, which will allow it to start to germinate. And then another advantage of these seeds is that it can be transported long distances by wind or animals. So the wind can actually transport the seed, as we'll see in a second, and then also animals. And we're going to see in just a moment that a lot of our seeds are inside of fruits. And so when you eat a fruit, and now we're talking about animals. When the animals eat the fruit, they're not eating around the seeds. They're eating the entire fruit, including the seeds. And so what happens is that animal then walks somewhere else. It, of course, has feces, And the seeds make it through the digestive tract and into the feces. And so when it poops, it releases those seeds in a nice, nutrient-rich media that will allow them to grow and be favorable. So as we mentioned before, the seeds are traditionally dormant. And the reason that they go through the dormancy is so that it increases the chances for the organism to survive once it germinates. So as I said before, with the germination based on heat, if there's heat from the fire, this can be advantageous to that plant because of the fact that now there's no competition. Okay, so when it breaks that seed dormancy, it of course has those environmental clues from temperature or lighting. Another example has to do with imbibition, which has to do with the uptake of water. And so there is actually a low water potential inside of the seed, and so the water will rush into the seed, which will allow it to basically crack open or break open, which will help with the germination process. As I mentioned yesterday, the angiosperms are flowering plants. So the flower is the structure found on angiosperms, and it specializes for sexual reproduction. So reproduction in plants and in flowers, most importantly, has to do with pollination. So the pollen from one flower, of course, would fertilize the another flower, or it could be self-pollination, which fertilizes the same flower. And so this pollination occurs, as I said before, by insects or animals, as well as it could be just wind pollinated. Now on the flower, there are a lot of different specialized components to it, which are all modified leaves. You have the sepals. These are what's going to enclose the flower. So if you've ever looked at a flower bud, you would be looking at the sepals. The petals are going to be brightly colored, and their job is to attract pollinators. This is usually the colored part that you see on the flower. Your stamen is going to produce the pollen. This is where the male gametophyte is. This is where the sperm is. So inside of the pollen is your male gametophyte, and inside the male gametophyte, of course, would be your sperm. And then the carpels are going to produce the ovules, which consists of the ovary, the style, and then the stigma. Okay, and so the ovary is at the base of the flower. There's this long tube, which is your style, and at the very top is where the stigma is. And the stigma is kind of sticky and moist, and its job is to germinate the pollen grain when it binds. So the pollen grain is going to bind to the stigma, which is going to cause the pollen grain to germinate, which will then give rise to the pollen tube and the two sperm, which will then go down and fertilize the egg in the ovary. So here you can see the picture of the flower showing all the different parts. Here you see the sepal. The job is to enclose and protect the floral bud before it opens. You also see the petals, which are brightly colored, and the job is to kind of advertise for insects and other pollinators to visit the flower. We have the reproductive organs for the male, which would be the stamen, which is made up of the anther and the filament. The anther is where the pollen actually is, and then the filament just kind of holds it up there. And so if the stamen is higher than the carpel, traditionally it will go through self-fertilization. If the stamen is lower than the carpel, then it would probably rely more on cross-pollination. And so here we see our female organs. This would be in our carpel, but I remember that they're the female organs is because females traditionally go through carpel, okay, versus stamen. Men is in the name of it. And so there's three parts to the carpel. You have the ovary, you have the style, which is that long tube, and then of course you have your stigma, and I always call it the sticky stigma. So students absolutely just love when we go over this. So the fruit that you guys like to eat, you know, your tomatoes and your apples and your oranges, those are actually made up of the mature ovaries. So the ovaries of the plants. Sometimes it has other components of the flower also. And the whole point of the fruit is to protect the seed, but it also helps for the dispersal of the seed. So as I mentioned before, animals will oftentimes eat the fruit, and when they eat the fruit, they tend to eat the seeds as well, which allows the seed to be deposited in a nutrient-rich environment after it passes through the digestive tract of that animal. And your fruits can either be fleshy, kind of thinking like a tomato, or it can be dry, like a hazelnut. So as I said before, there's different ways that the fruits can be dispersed. They can be dispersed by the wind. So the wind, as you see here on this one, there's some wings, which will allow the fruit to kind of spiral in the air, so it'll be just distributed. Also, we see the seeds kind of can be within berries, and so the animal will eat the berry or eat the fruit, and of course pass the seed through its digestive tract. And we also see with barbs. So you oftentimes, whenever you go through the woods, you pick up these hitchhikers, right? Those hitchhikers are actually seeds. And so as they get stuck to you or to your animals, it's bringing those seeds to a new location to deposit them so that they can then grow in that new environment. So here we see, again, some more of our fruit dispersal mechanisms. You see that the coconut can be dispersed by water. So that coconut, yes, the entire coconut is one fruit. And so the coconut is actually going to be buoyant, so it can actually get into the water from one island, and then it floats to another island so that it can then, of course, start growing in the new island, make a new coconut tree. You can also be dispersed by animals, as we talked about before. It can be barbed, so it kind of gets stuck in the fur of the animal. Also, you see it in the feces. And the last one I think is kind of funny. When you think about squirrels, every year you always see the squirrels kind of getting their nuts, and then they dig a hole, they put nuts down into the ground. So what these squirrels are actually doing is that they're planting seeds so that whenever they forget about those, now these seeds have been planted, and they will then grow to form the new plant. And then also we see the wind dispersal. So you see the parachute of the dandelion, you see the winged seed of the Asian climbing gourd, and then also the winged fruit of the maple. And then also tumbleweeds, because kids always think it's funny to look at the tumbleweeds and think that tumbleweeds are actually, there's seeds in there. So in the angiosperm life cycle, we're kind of looking at how does the angiosperm go through reproduction. So there's a double fertilization process that occurs in which the pollen tube is going to disperse or discharge 2 sperm into the female gametophyte. The first sperm is actually going to fertilize the egg just like normal. And the second one combines with 2 nuclei in the central cell of the gametophyte, which will then make this food storing kind of area, which is called the endosperm. And the job of the endosperm is to nourish that developing embryo. So inside of your seed, the embryo is usually going to be consisting of a root, and then it usually will have some type of seed leaves. It may have 1 or it may have 2. If it only has 1 seed leaves, we call it a monocot. If it has 2 seeds, we call it a dicot. And the cot just stands for cotyledon, which are just seed leaves. So these leaves are actually inside of the seed, so that once the plant can grow large enough to emerge from the soil, then those leaves can allow that plant to then generate, of course, go through photosynthesis and make its own sugar using those seed leaves. So here you can see the double fertilization component. So the pollen grain is going to bind to the sticky stigma, which is going to germinate, and there'll be a pollen tube. You see this yellow pollen tube right here forms, and 2 sperm will then go down the pollen tube. So that pollen tube is going to continue to grow down until it actually makes its way into an opening at the very bottom of the ovule. So within the ovule is where you're going to find the egg. So the egg is right here. So one of the sperm is going to fertilize that egg, and the second one is going to kind of fertilize these 2 polar nuclei right here. And so what ends up happening is you make the endosperm, which will be the nutrients for that growing embryo, and then of course you make your zygote. So there's 2 main groups of angiosperms you can have. And so this would be your monocots and your eudicots. Traditionally, we just call those dicots. But the monocot has 1 cotyledon or 1 seed leaf, while the dicots have 2 cotyledons or 2 seed leaves. And there's a lot of other different characteristics between them, and we're going to look at those in just a moment. So here we can see some of the differences. As I said before, the monocots have 1 cotyledon and the dicots have 2 cotyledons. Another way to tell the difference is that the veins in the monocot are parallel, so you can see here that they're all running parallel to one another, okay? Versus in our dicot, it's more of a net, so you can kind of see it kind of branches out a little bit, and it's not parallel. Also, if you look at the stems, the vascular tissue is scattered in the monocot, and it looks like a circle in our dicot. It's arranged in a ring in the dicot. Monocots traditionally have more fibrous root structures, while the eudicot or the dicot has one main root that all the roots come kind of off of it. The pollen has one opening in our monocot, and there's 3 openings in our dicot. And then the coolest one is that in our monocots, all the flowers are multiples of 3. So it's 3, it's 6, or it's 9, or so on and so forth. Versus a dicot is going to be multiples of 4. So you'll have a 4 or an 8, or so on and so forth. Or you'll have like a 5 or a 10, okay, or so on and so forth. You do sometimes run into the issue where sometimes you can't tell whether it's a monocot or a dicot because of the fact that things could interact. Like, for example, if there was 12, you don't know whether that's a monocot or a dicot because of the fact that it's a multiple of 3 and a multiple of 4. So kind of beware of that when you are looking at these. I don't think you should see one of those, but just in case. So as I said before, there's 3 main organs that we have in our plants. This would be, of course, the roots, the stems, and the leaves. And so when we think about our roots, there's a root system and a shoot system. The root system is made up of the roots, and the shoot system is made up of your stem and your leaves. And so the roots rely on sugar produced by the shoot system. So as photosynthesis occurs in the leaves, that sugar then goes down the phloem to the roots to provide those non-photosynthetic cells to be able to obtain sugar. And the shoots are going to rely on the water and the minerals that are absorbed by the roots. So the roots are where you're going to pull the water at to bring up to the leaves. And so these 2 systems do rely heavily on one another. So as I said before, roots are a multicellular organism that kind of help to anchor the plant. It gives stability to that plant so that it kind of stays where it's supposed to be. It helps to absorb any type of minerals and water. And also it can store a lot of different nutrients. So during the winter time, when a plant usually loses its leaves, it's running off of the stored nutrients from the season where it has already stored all that sugar and whatnot. And so in most plants, the absorption of the water and the minerals kind of occurs through these things called root hairs. Root hairs are just long little hairs, kind of extensions of the epidermis in the root material. And so as we've seen before, if you have a highly folded area, it increases surface area, which can kind of help to bring in or actually increase the diffusion rate. And so diffusion or osmosis, since we're talking about water, these root hairs are going to help to increase osmosis of the water across the root cells. So the stem is actually kind of the organ that gives the structure to the plant. It's that part that is usually the stem or the trunk that you would see in a tree or a plant. And so there are these alternating systems of nodes, which is where the leaves are attaching, and then internodes, which is just the segments of the stem in between. And then we have our leaves. Our leaves are the main photosynthetic organ that we have for our plant. And so usually it has 2 different components. It has the blade and it has the stalk that kind of helps to join the leaf to the node of the stem. And so we've said before that sometimes these leaves are larger to increase surface area for photosynthesis. And we've also talked about before that on these leaves there's going to be stomata, which are little pores. And so it can actually lose water through this stomata, so it kind of has to regulate the size of its leaves or the number of its leaves to ensure that it doesn't lose too much water. So as I said before, in that leaf we do have this epidermis, or the skin, if you may, of the leaves. And so there's all these little pores in it called the stomata. The stomata is going to allow the carbon dioxide to flow into the leaf, and it's going to allow the oxygen to flow back out of the leaf. Also, as a evaporation occurs or transpiration occurs, water can also leave out of the stomata. We also have these cells that surround the stomata. They're called guard cells, and this regulates the opening and closing of that stomata. And we've talked about before that this guard cell, when it's turgid, the stomata is open, and when it becomes flaccid, then the guard cells actually lose their kind of buccal rigidity, which causes them to lay flat, which closes the stomata. And then the main kind of flesh of the leaf is called the mesophyll, which is kind of sandwiched between the upper and lower epidermis. So let's take a quick little detour about how humans have modified different crops. And so humans have interfered a lot in the reproduction, the genetic makeup of plants. We've already seen this before with Mendel. We mentioned how Mendel was trying to study the pea plants, so he actually pollinated the plants by cutting off the stamen of one flower and brushing it onto the stigma of another flower. We've also seen this when we went through genetic engineering to make the rice that had vitamin A in it for the underprivileged or the kind of impoverished nations that were having a vitamin A deficiency. And we've also kind of seen that this hibernation kind of helps to bring new genes in and helps to change a lot of the crops that we have. So one example of that, kind of this crop change due to artificial selection, is that this is what maize is. So back in the day, corn actually looked like this. And now this is what corn looks like. So over time, due to artificial selection, we've kind of changed this plant or this crop into something that humans are more likely to want or to eat. So biotechnology and genetic engineering doesn't just have to deal with animals, it could deal with plants. And so there's two different meanings for this biotechnology in terms of plants. So first, it has to do with innovations and using plants to make some type of useful product. And another way, you can use genetically modified organisms for kind of agricultural and industry. And then, of course, it's not limited just to transferring the genes of closely related species. It can actually transfer genes from multiple different ones because of the fact that the genetic code is universal. So these genetically modified plants, they are made worldwide. We kind of figured out that there's not really many plants nowadays that aren't technically genetically modified in some way. And so these transgenic crops have been developed so that they can produce proteins that kind of defend them against insects. And so they make genes that make the plants actually resistant to a lot of the pests. Also, it makes them tolerant to herbicides, so you can still use your herbicides to stop these herbivores from, taking over your plants. But the plants themselves are not harmed. And then also you can have it to resist specific diseases. So as I mentioned before, you could have the golden rice. This is a variety of rice that was made to kind of help with the vitamin A deficiencies in kind of the poor, impoverished nations. Vitamin A deficiencies actually cause blindness. And in these countries, they tend to eat a lot of rice. And so what they've done is they've made this transgenic rice that has vitamin A in it. So as you're eating the rice, you're bringing in vitamin A, which helps with those deficiencies. So that brings us to the end of Hodgepodge Part 2. So you should continue working on your AP Review notebook.